Fellow members and guests, men, when was the last time you cried? This morning? Last week? Last year? Never? When was the last time you saw a man in your life cry? And what type of crying was it? Was it, watery eyes, trembling lip, or perhaps a single man tear down a stoic face, or perhaps the blubbering crying of a child with snot bubbles? Right? So, as men, we learn not to cry in a lot of ways, and it's a voluntary thing that happens. It's an emotional thing that we respond to, but we fight it. We learn to fight it and to not cry at times. But we don't start out this way. We start out as babies, and as babies, you can cry for anything and everything, right? Any reason whatsoever. You cry when you're hungry. You cry when your diaper's full. You cry when somebody looks at you funny. Now, as we grow older, we have to adjust this, right? And as a man, if you cried every time you were hungry, I think the follow-up question would be, is your diaper full? So we grow, we adjust, we learn to constrain and to hold back, right? And so where does this come from? When I grew up, my father in particular was a very sensitive man. He had no issues crying. He would cry, all the time. Just as an example, I was having dinner with my dad, my brother, and my mom, and we were talking, and randomly, Charlotte's Web came up as a story. Now, if you're familiar with Charlotte's Web, it's a story about a spider that helps a pig that's about to go to slaughter stay alive by writing messages in the web, right? Well, it has something of a tragic end, so spoiler alert, Charlotte dies. My dad either forgot this or didn't know about it, whatever. So when my brother mentioned it, he paused and stared at him and just said, "Wait, Charlotte died?" And his eyes started to water, and he started crying. And so all of us just naturally laughed, right? As I mentioned before, you think of us as completely insensitive. This was a common occurrence, and he thought it was funny as well, right? So I did not inherit this sensitivity that he had. I went the complete opposite direction and learned not to cry ever. And I either blame possibly the action-packed superhero movies that I watched in the 80s and 90s, Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Norris. To my memory, these guys didn't cry. Maybe Stallone in Rocky, maybe Arnold and Junior, but we'll forget that. These guys didn't cry. They left the crying up to the women and children or the weaker enemies, right? So this is what I learned. And this is how I felt. It became ingrained in my psyche that men do not cry. If I go to a movie and I'm sitting in the theater and an emotional scene comes on, I immediately, and if I feel that wave coming, I immediately withdraw. I stare at the exit sign at the back of the theater, and I wait for it to pass. And then once it passes, I start to pay attention again. So how does this happen, and where do these perceptions come from? Well, one thing I'd like to test out is where all of you stand, and sit on some ideas of when is appropriate for men to cry, right? So I'm going to ask a couple scenarios, run scenarios by you, and just kind of think in the back of your head, yes or no, as to whether or not it's appropriate for a man to cry, and then we'll sort of see where you land here. All right, so scenario one. You go to Sheridan's Frozen Custard for dessert, and they're out of your favorite wedding cake concrete. Appropriate time for a man to cry, yes or no?
No.
Scenario two, watching Titanic with your girlfriend or wife in the privacy of your own home.
Yes.
3, watching your favorite team, the Chiefs, lose to the Raiders at Arrowhead and fail to make the playoffs. Okay. 4, beating the Russians at the Olympics as a member of the U.S. hockey team in an upset victory during the Cold War.
Yes.
5, at the funeral for a beloved family member or friend with whom you had a close relationship.
Yes.
Right. So if you answered no to all 5 of those questions, you're off the man spectrum, and you should probably seek counseling. If you answered yes to 1 or 2, you get to retain your man card. If you answered 3 or more, we're going to need to talk. So am I being too harsh? Perhaps it's not good to be so repressed as men. Perhaps we need to relax some of these standards. Now, as I've gotten older, I've relaxed a lot of the standards that I had. So in particular, I feel and notice that the gravity of situations more and more as I've gotten older. And I feel that comes a little bit with understanding of life. Every man, whether he admits it or not, deals with crime on his own, possibly in a moment of vulnerability in a private situation, right? So for me, that was a Pampers commercial with baby animals running to Rod Stewart's Forever Young. Please do not tell anyone about that. But ultimately, we have to come to grips with this and have to deal with this individually as men. And over time, I've come to see crime as a sign of strength, as it is fear and mindless observance of social norms that more often forces us into holding back our emotions. So I'll leave you with a relevant quote that is from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And he says, "But there was no need to be ashamed of tears, for tears bore witness that man had the greatest of courage, the courage to suffer." And by the way, missing out on wedding cake concrete does not qualify as suffering.